So, empathy, how people think and feel. We see it a lot in gaming, everything from AAA to indie nowadays. But then the question arises of what creates empathy in video games? How could we possibly empathize? Well, it's through relatable characters, characters that we see ourselves in. Specifically, when presented with guilt and shame, we tend to relate to characters more. We'd relate to the experiences, relationships, and coping mechanisms of these characters. So then there's the other question of why do we care? Well, when we empathize with characters, it tells us a lot about ourselves. We can begin to reflect on our own experiences, and from a psychological perspective, it's useful to identify how we might cope differently. This essay will be informed by Jessica Van Valle's Shame and Trauma, as well as Nathanson's Compass of Shame. Without further ado, here we go. So what is shame, what is guilt, and what is the difference between the two of them? According to Jessica Van Valle, shame is based on identity. This can be internal, thoughts about oneself, or external, what others think of you. On the other hand, guilt is based off of an offending action. Essentially, I feel bad about myself versus I feel bad about this action. Donald Nathanson created the Compass of Shame, which acknowledges 4 different coping strategies with dealing with shame: withdrawal, attacking oneself, avoidance, and attacking others. Withdrawal is having a negative experience, which is perceived as valid, that results in hiding. Attacking oneself has a negative experience perceived as valid, resulting in self-directed anger. Avoidance is refusal to acknowledge a situation and choosing to distract oneself. And attacking others is a potential refusal of an experience or validity of an experience, which then results in trying to make someone else feel worse. When it comes to empathy, Undertale is the game about empathy and morality in the indie world. Undertale was one of the first games to question morality of player choice in regards to killing NPCs. The basic plot is that many years ago, after a great war, monsters were sealed underground by humans. 7 souls were required to break this barrier trapping them underground. The player character, who I will refer to as Frisk for the sake of this essay, is the final soul needed to break said barrier, and the game follows their journey. This game is also iconic for the many diverse characters suffering due to grief, guilt, and shame. Alphys is the royal scientist, and a character met in the later half of the game. Immediately, she is presented as awkward and anxious, although very helpful. She dreams of helping others and hopefully confessing her feelings to her friend Undyne. However, her guilt over the DT, or the determination experiments, keeps her prone to withdrawal. The determination experiments were experiments done on dying monsters. When monsters die, they turn to dust in this world. However, humans do not physically perish due to their souls, souls being the culmination of one's being. A human soul has a significantly stronger amount of power than monster souls. This power is known as determination. At the request of the king, Alphys took in willing, dying monsters as test subjects to see the effects of determination on monster souls. Unfortunately, while this appeared to work at first, the monsters soon became breaking down and becoming the amalgamations. Despite this being an accidental effect, Alphys's anxiety and low self-esteem in combination with guilt causes her to experience shame. She attempted to hide away in her lab, ignoring calls from the king and the families of the amalgamations. It is also heavily replied by Alphys's choice of words that she is suicidal as a result of said guilt. Why this creates empathy is that many can relate to Alphys and her anxiety on a personal level, especially those with anxiety themselves. Players may relate to Alphys's thought process and how she withdraws from her friends. Players can then examine how their perception of their own events may have created a similar effect. For example, turning mistakes into blame often leads to rumination and self-hatred. Players can see how this process plays out in Alphys and can recognize it in themselves. It is also hoped that players will recognize confronting these feelings and beginning to forgive oneself is the healthy way to cope, and hopefully they will follow in Alphys's footsteps. One of the most interesting games in terms of guilt and shame would be Omori. Although fairly recent, it's commended for its unique way of tackling trauma and guilt specifically. Players take on the role of a young boy named Sunny. In order to cope with his sister Mari's death, Sunny creates an alternate persona known as Omori, and he and all of his friends live in this dreamscape world known as Headspace. Players soon come to find that it is 4 years later and Sunny is to move away soon. In the real world, you find that all of his friends are very different from their dreamscape counterparts. Sunny's friend Aubrey had the most striking personality change after Mari's death. Originally a kind and cheery girl, she was always excited to hang out with her friends, and it was implied that she had a crush on Sunny in the past. As everyone grew apart after Mari's death, she perceived this as her friends leaving her behind and quickly recovering from Mari's death. Out of anger, guilt, and grief, she began to lash out. She befriended the Hooligans, a group of children delinquents of which she's the head of. She began bullying her old friend Basil on the assumption that he scribbled over all the pictures of Mari that were left over. Aubrey soon took on the harsh delinquent personality, abandoning her old friends, speaking to them harshly, refusing to listen to them, and even going as far as to attack them. It is clear that Aubrey holds guilt over herself for said actions. However, in her inability to process this, it leads to her taking her anger out on other people. What makes Aubrey so relatable is that due to her young age, it's incredibly understandable why would she react out of anger and find difficulty coping in her situation. Many players, especially those with childhood trauma of some kind, could probably relate to Aubrey's anger. While guilt and shame can look like sadness, it can also look like anger. Many often lash out due to confusion or frustration. The most important part of Aubrey's character arc is her ability to eventually face her guilt, and not only apologize to her old friends, but to begin to rekindle her friendships. Players can understand the importance of having support systems and proper coping mechanisms in place after seeing Aubrey's situation. Despite the extremity of these characters' circumstances, it's easy to see why we can see ourselves in them. As players, we have to ask ourselves why now. We have to keep asking ourselves, what does this remind us of? Why do we empathize with this character? Is it their experience that seems similar to our own? Is it the way that we cope with them? And then from there, is our strategy good or bad? How can we change how we think? And as designers, it's important to keep making more of these. It's important to challenge the standards, add more questions on mental health, on racism, on sexuality. Because as designers, we have the power to present healthy thinking. We have the power to present healthy choices and to teach these to the players.